Everything can be taken from a man, but one thing, the last of human freedoms. To choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. To choose one's own way. These words weren't written in the comfort of a university office or during a peaceful evening of philosophical reflection. They were conceived in one of humanity's darkest places in the history. The Nazi German concentration camps of World War II. The man who wrote them, Viktor Frankl, discovered something profound about human nature while surrounded by unimaginable suffering. Today we are going to explore how a young psychiatrist's journey through hell became one of the most important books of the 20th century, and why his insights about meaning, freedom, and the human spirit remains as relevant as they were nearly 80 years ago. Viktor Frankl was born in Vienna in 1905 into a world that was rapidly changing. As a young man, he was fascinated by the human mind. Why we do what we do, what drives us, what breaks us, and what heals us. He studied medicine and specialized in neurology and psychiatry, eventually developing his own approach to therapy that he called logotherapy, from the Greek word logos, meaning purpose or meaning. Logos is a very powerful and potent word and was an incredibly important concept in the Greek ancient philosophy, but let's not explore it here. Frankl's life took a dramatic turn in 1942. As a Jew in Nazi-occupied Austria, he was deported to a concentration camp, along with his pregnant wife, parents, and brother. Over the next 3 years, he would experience 4 different camps, including the notorious Auschwitz-Birkenau. His wife, parents, and brother would not survive. He lost everything: his family, his life's work, a manuscript he had been writing for years, his identity, and of course, his freedom. And yet, in the midst of this absolute devastation, Frank made observations that would revolutionize psychology and give millions of people a new way to understand suffering and meaning. When Frank was liberated in 1945, he weighed less than 90 pounds, so like 50 kilograms. He returned to Vienna to discover that almost everyone he loved was gone. Most people might have been consumed by bitterness, rage, or despair. Instead, Frank did something remarkable. He began to write. In just 9 days, working almost non-stop, he dictated the first version of what would become Man's Search for Meaning. The book was originally titled A Psychologist Experiences the Concentration Camp in German, but its English title captures something deeper. The fundamental human drive that Frank believed was more powerful than even the drive for pleasure or power. Drive for meaning, of course, because the title is Man's Search for Meaning. And the book is unlike any other Holocaust memoir you will ever read. It's written with the clinical eye of a psychiatrist, but also with the heart of someone who has lived through unimaginable suffering. The book is divided into 2 distinct parts that work together to create something profound. The first part reads like a psychological case study of extreme human experience. Frank doesn't dwell on the graphic details of camp life, though he doesn't shy away from the reality either. Instead, he focuses on the mental and emotional journey that prisoners went through, and also his own journey. So let's briefly walk through his story. Frank begins with his arrest in 1942 and the journey to the first camp. He describes the initial shock, the complete disorientation of being stripped not just of possessions, but of identity itself. Prisoners became numbers. Their heads were shaved, their clothes taken, their names replaced with registration numbers. This first phase, Frank observed, was characterized by delusions of reprieve, the desperate hope that somehow this couldn't be real, that they would be released, that it was all a mistake. Then came what Frank called the second phase, apathy. This was a psychological defense mechanism where prisoners became emotionally numb to protect themselves from the constant horror. They stopped reacting to the beatings of other prisoners and daily humiliations. Frank describes how this apathy was actually necessary for survival. Those who remained too sensitive often couldn't endure. But within this apathy, Frank made crucial observations. He watched some prisoners maintain their inner dignity despite everything. He saw men who shared their last piece of bread with others, who comforted fellow prisoners, who found small ways to preserve their humanity. He noticed that those who had something to live for, a manuscript to complete like himself, a loved one to reunite with, or unfinished work in the free world, were more likely to survive than those who were physically stronger but had lost their sense of purpose and couldn't abstract over this horror. Frank also describes these strange moments of beauty that could still penetrate even this hell. A sunset view through barbed wire, a piece of music hummed by a fellow prisoner, a kind word from a guard. These moments weren't just pleasant distractions, they were proof that the human capacity for transcendence couldn't be completely destroyed. And the third phase he describes is liberation and readjustment, which surprisingly wasn't the pure joy one might expect. Many prisoners found it difficult to feel pleasure again, struggled with guilt about surviving when others hadn't, and faced the devastating reality of what they had lost. Frank returned to Vienna to discover his wife, parents, and brother were all dead. His life's work destroyed. Throughout all of this, Frank analyzes these experiences with the eye of a psychiatrist. He writes about how prisoners who had given up would often die within days, how some found ways to maintain their humanity even in dehumanizing conditions, and how the promise of reuniting with the loved ones could literally keep someone alive. The second part of the book introduces logotherapy, Frank's revolutionary approach to therapy that focuses on helping people find meaning rather than just treating symptoms. This isn't just abstract theory. It's a practical method born from the most extreme testing grounds imaginable. The book's style is straightforward and accessible, but it carries enormous emotional weight. Frank writes with restraint. He never sensationalizes his suffering or asks for pity. Instead, he offers observations about human nature that feel both deeply personal and universally relevant. There's a quiet dignity in his writing that reflects the very principles he is describing. The most important elements that emerge from his story are these: that meaning can be found in any circumstance, that our response to suffering defines us more than the suffering itself, and that human beings have an unconquerable core of freedom that no external forces can touch. What makes this book extraordinary isn't just that it's a Holocaust memoir, though it's certainly that. Is that Frank used his suffering as a laboratory for understanding human nature at its most essential level. And here's what Frank discovered that changed everything. Survival wasn't necessarily about physical strength, intelligence, or even luck. It was about meaning. Those who have a why to live can bear with almost any how. Frank wrote borrowing from Nietzsche. But unlike Nietzsche, who saw meaning as something we must create in an essentially meaningless universe, Frank believed that meaning was something to be discovered, that it exists inherently in our relationships, our work, and even in how we face unavoidable suffering. In the most extreme circumstances imaginable, where human beings were reduced to numbers, starved, tortured, and murdered, Frank found that the human spirit's most essential quality wasn't its capacity for happiness or pleasure. It was its need for meaning. This insight feels incredibly relevant today. We live in a time of unprecedented material prosperity, at least in the developed world. Yet depression, anxiety, and what we might call existential emptiness or existential crisis seem to be everywhere. Perhaps we have focused so much on eliminating suffering and maximizing pleasure that we have forgotten how essential meaning is to human flourishing. Frankl's experiences led him to develop logotherapy, which he positioned as the third Viennese school of psychotherapy, after Freud's psychoanalysis and Adler's individual psychology. Where Freud saw humans as primarily driven by the will to pleasure and Adler by the will to power, Frankl proposed that we are fundamentally driven by a will to meaning. But here's what's beautiful about logotherapy. It doesn't tell you what your meaning should be. Instead, it helps you discover what meaning you can find in your particular circumstances, relationships, and challenges. Frankl believed that meaning was highly individual and couldn't be given to someone else. It had to be found by each person for themselves. And this approach was actually revolutionary in psychology at that time. Rather than focusing primarily on pathology, what's wrong with people, logotherapy focuses on what makes life worth living. It suggests that even in the face of unavoidable suffering, we can find meaning through our response to that suffering. Perhaps the most profound insight from Frankl's work is his understanding of human freedom. In the camps, he and his fellow prisoners had been stripped of virtually every external freedom. Where to go, where to eat, what to eat and when to sleep, and even how to respond to guards without being punished or killed. But Frankl realized that there was one freedom that couldn't be taken away: the freedom to choose one's attitude toward whatever circumstances they faced. This wasn't just philosophical speculation, it was a particular discovery that meant the difference between spiritual survival and collapse. Everything can be taken from a man, but one thing, he wrote. The last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. This is both liberating and terrifying, isn't it? It's liberating because it means that no matter what happens to us, we retain some essential power over our inner lives. But it's terrifying because it means we are ultimately responsible for how we respond to our circumstances, even when those circumstances are beyond our control. Frankl's work also touches on something we might call vocation or calling. He believed that meaning often comes from dedicating ourselves to something larger than ourselves, whether that's other people, a cause, or creative work. But he was careful to distinguish this from mere goal setting or achievement. So for Frankl, meaning isn't just about what we accomplish, but about how we serve. It's about what he called self-transcendence. The human capacity to reach beyond ourselves, towards something or someone else. This might be love for another person, dedication to a cause, or even the way we choose to face suffering. This connects to something many people struggle with today: the feeling that their work is meaningless, that their lives lack direction or purpose. Frankl would suggest that the solution isn't necessarily to find a different job or make dramatic life changes, but to discover what meaning might exist in your current circumstances, relationships, and responsibilities. Nearly 80 years after Frankl's liberation, his insights feel remarkably current. We are living through what many psychologists call an epidemic of meaninglessness. It's not something very new, but something that's still very relatable. Despite unprecedented material prosperity, rates of depression, anxiety, and continue to rise, particularly among young people, sadly. Social media often leaves us feeling disconnected rather than connected. Many traditional sources of meaning, like religion, community, or family structures, have weakened without being replaced by equally powerful alternatives. Career success, which previous generations might have found meaningful, often feels hollow or just temporary today. Frank's work suggests that the solution isn't to eliminate all suffering or maximize all pleasure, but to find ways to make our lives meaningful through our relationships, work, our creative expression, and yes, even through how we face the inevitable difficulties of being human. And there is also something else Frankl discovered that feels particularly relevant today. He noticed that happiness couldn't be pursued directly. It was a byproduct of living meaningfully. The more directly someone pursued happiness, the more it seemed to elude them. But those who dedicated themselves to something beyond themselves, so transcendence, often found happiness as a natural consequence. This runs counter to much of contemporary culture, which often suggests that happiness should be our primary goal. Frank would argue that this approach is backwards. Happiness comes from meaning, not the other way around. Consider your own experience. When have you felt most fulfilled? Was it when you were directly pursuing your own happiness, or when you were absorbed in something that felt important, like you were a part of something bigger? Caring for someone else, working on a project that matters to you, or overcoming a significant challenge in your life. Perhaps the most challenging aspect of Frank's philosophy is his view of suffering. He certainly didn't romanticize suffering or suggest that it was good in itself. He experienced too much unnecessary suffering to ever make that mistake. But he did believe that when suffering is unavoidable, we can find meaning through how we respond to it. This, of course, doesn't mean we should seek out suffering or accept suffering that could be prevented or alleviated. But it does mean that when we face genuine hardship like loss, illness, failure, disappointment, which are unavoidable, we can choose to respond in ways that create meaning rather than only bitterness. One of Frank's most powerful insights was his suggestion that we often ask the wrong question about life. And instead of asking what is the meaning of life, he suggested we should ask something like, what is life asking of me right now? This shifts the focus from finding some universal, abstract meaning to discovering what meaning might be available in our particular circumstances. It makes meaning concrete and actionable, rather than philosophical and distant. What's life asking of you right now? That's the question. Maybe it's asking you to be present for someone who needs you. Maybe it's asking you to develop a skill or pursue an opportunity. Maybe it's asking you to face a difficult truth about yourself or your situation. Maybe it's asking you to forgive someone, including yourself. The beauty of this approach is that it doesn't require you to have everything figured out right now. It just requires you to pay attention to what's in front of you and respond thoughtfully as you can. Frank's approach also offers a way to live with the uncertainty that characterizes modern life. Rather than needing to know the ultimate purpose of existence, we can focus on finding meaning in our immediate circumstances and relationships. This feels particularly relevant in a time when traditional certainties have been shaken. Many people no longer have clear religious or cultural frameworks that could tell them what their lives should mean. Frank's approach suggests that meaning can be discovered rather than inherited, that it can be found in the particular rather than only in the universal. Viktor Frankl's life and work reminds us that human beings are incredibly resilient, but not in the way we might expect. Our resiliency doesn't come primarily from our ability to avoid suffering or to always be happy. It comes from our capacity to find meaning, to transcend our immediate circumstances through our response to them, and to connect with something larger than ourselves. In a world that often feels chaotic and meaningless, Frank's insights offer not easy answers, but something more valuable, a way of approaching life that can create meaning even in the midst of difficulty. His tragic story reminds us that our circumstances, however challenging, don't determine our inner lives. We always retain the freedom to choose our attitude, to decide what our experiences will mean, and to respond in ways that honor our deepest values. And perhaps the most beautiful thing about Frank's approach is that it doesn't require extraordinary circumstances to be meaningful. Meaning can be found in ordinary relationships, everyday work, small acts of kindness, and quiet moments of reflection. The question isn't whether your life can be meaningful, but whether you are paying attention to the meaning that's already available to you. This video is also a part of our 2025 reading challenge, and this book was our book for June. Now it's time to release our book for July, and our next position is Solaris by Stanisław Lem is a fascinating and slightly retro sci-fi novel about a mysterious planet Solaris and an exploration of the infinite ocean that covers the whole surface of the planet. The book is very philosophical in nature. It explores topics such as alien intelligence, but also the purpose of scientific exploration. It's also time to give you a hint about our book for April. This novel follows several generations of a family, blending magical events with everyday life. Time seems to loop and characters often share the same name. It's a famous work of a Latin American author, and it explores topics of solitude, history, and fate. Frank's insights about human freedom, that our ultimate freedom is to choose our attitude, raise fascinating questions about responsibility and choice that other philosophers have explored in different ways. If we are truly free to choose our responses to any situation, what does that mean for how we live? What are the implications of this radical freedom, and how do we handle the weight of that responsibility? These are some of the questions that Jean-Paul Sartre and other existentialists grappled with intensely. If you're curious about it, I have a whole another video on that topic. You can watch it here. And for now, thank you for watching, and I hope you find this video interesting. Don't forget to give me a like and a subscription if you would like to see more videos like this somewhere in the future. Thanks once again. Goodbye.